Welcome to Ignatius Press Off the Shelf. We're getting towards the end of The Everlasting Man by G.K. Chesterton. The next book we're going to read is a novel by Kudry von Lefort, The Wedding of Magdeburg. So please start preparing that. For this chapter 5, it's called The Escape from Paganism. And again, I think there's some brilliant things in here. And I kind of wanted Joseph to read certain passages for us, but maybe Vivian or Joseph, you want to start somewhere else.
I don't have much actually specifically highlighted here, so I'm happy for you to take the lead, Father, personally.
Okay, well, so on page 232, which is the first page of the chapter, the new paragraph up to the first line of the next page.
Yeah.
Read that for us.
So if the missionary says.
Yeah.
If the missionary says, in fact, that he is exceptional in being a Christian, and that the rest of the races and religions can be collectively classified as heathen, he is perfectly right. He may say it in quite the wrong spirit, in which case he is spiritually wrong. But in the cold light of philosophy and history, he is intellectually right. He may not be right-minded, but he is right. He may not even have a right to be right, but he is. The outer world to which he brings his creed really is something subject to certain generalizations covering all its varieties, and is not merely a variety of similar creeds. Perhaps it is in any case too much of a temptation to pride or hypocrisy to call it heathenry. Perhaps it would be better simply to call it humanity.
That's it. Okay,
Okay.
This corresponds to the chapter in Miracles by C.S. Lewis called Christianity and, quote, religion, where he says that all other religions except Christianity really are a representation of man's search for God, man's search for meaning, man's search for something transcendent. Christianity is radically different because it's about God's search for man or God's revelation to man. And so you really can't have such a thing as comparative religion when you go into the profoundest sense of it, because Christ is incomparable even though he's a man, and Christianity is incomparable even though it's an institution.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then I thought it's beautiful on page 236. The top of the page of for creation means rejection. But if you read Joseph from where on about 4 lines down, 5, for a man cannot make statues, to the end of the paragraph.
Sure. For a man cannot make statues without rejecting stone. And there really is this ultimate unmorality behind the metaphysics of Asia. And the reason is that there has been nothing through all those unthinkable ages to bring the human mind sharply to the point, to tell it that the time has come to choose. The mind has lived too much in eternity. The soul has been too immortal in the special sense that it ignores the idea of mortal sin. It has had too much of eternity in the sense that it has not had enough of the hour of death and the day of judgment. It is not crucial enough in the literal sense that it has not had enough of the cross. That is what we mean when we say that Asia is very old. But strictly speaking, Europe is quite as old as Asia. Indeed, in a sense, any place is as old as any other place. What we mean is that Europe has not really gone on growing older. It has been born again.
And then he says, the next sentence, Asia is all humanity. So this is a beautiful thing he does in this chapter. He's showing that the Eastern religions with the cyclical recurrence, eternal recurrence, and so on, and with transcendence and leaving the world, and there's no real moral dimension to it. There's no crisis to it in the sense of making a decision. That comes with history is just round and round and round, whereas in Judaism and then in Christianity, it's a line, it's a story. You have to make decisions. They have consequences and so on. And in fact, they have consequences after this life. Uh, and then what he's going to say in the rest of the chapter is that that's humanity.
Yes.
And Asia has given us the best of what human minds can do with respect to religion. But then he says, if it hadn't been for Christianity, Europe would look just like Asia. And
Religiously speaking.
yeah,
Yes.
religiously speaking, exactly.
Yes. Now, I would like to add a note to this on page 237, where Chesterton points out what he doesn't mean by saying this. It does not, this is toward the bottom of the first full paragraph. It does not mean that there could not be good men or happy lives, for God has given all men a conscience, and a conscience can give all men a kind of peace. But it does mean that the tone and proportion of all these things, and especially the proportion of good and evil things, would be in the unchanged West what they are in the changeless East. I just think that's so important that he points out that, look, men they're given a conscience by God. We're made in the image of likeness of God. It's not as though we have no moral bearings at all. It's just that the whole sort of cosmic gooiness of it all that you see, right? That you see in the Eastern religions, you would see in Europe had it not been for Christ.
Well,
Yeah, I mean, The Man Who Was Thursday, Chesterton's novel, which was written, about 17 years before this, but is a parable exactly on this, because the six philosophers is humanity unassisted by revelation, and and Sunday, basically, God says to them, "You're all a group of well-intentioned jackasses." In other words, the seeking after truth is a good thing, but you really ultimately end up chasing your tail, this eternity, when you're going in circles and there's no way out of that circle, because that's as far as you can get. If you're going to get out, if you're going to break out of that circle, you need divine revelation. In other words, God has to enter the picture and show you things, reveal things to you that your human mind, using its human reason, cannot attain by itself. And that's exactly what Christ does in the incarnation. He enters the story and says, look, you've got as far as you can go. This is how you go further.
And to go back to this theme of choice, Jesus says, "And who do you say that I am?" Right? It isn't enough for him to just come in and do what he does and whatever. We have to, with our free will, accept what he says and does, and accept that now is our new mode of being in Christ. And it's a choice and it's a decision. And until that happens, you're kind of just in a fog without a lighthouse.
And back to that previous thing you read there about God gives everyone, conscience and so on. And but he also is saying that if it hadn't been for Christ, the West would look like the East. And he gives examples of that. And Joseph, if you read page 237, the bottom paragraph up to 6 lines of the next page, that he gives examples here.
Okay. In short, if classic paganism had lingered until now, a number of things might well have lingered with it, and they would look very like what we call the religions of the East. There would still be Pythagoreans teaching reincarnation, as there are still Hindus teaching reincarnation. There would still be Stoics making a religion out of reason and virtue, as there are still Confucians making a religion out of reason and virtue. There would still be Neoplatonists studying transcendental truths, the meaning of which was mysterious to other people and disputed even amongst themselves, as the Buddhists still study a transcendentalism mysterious to others and disputed among themselves. There would still be intelligent Apollonians, apparently worshipping the sun god, but explaining that they were worshipping the divine principle. Just as there are still intelligent Parsees, apparently worshipping the sun, but explaining that they are worshipping the deity. There would still be wild Dionysians dancing on the mountain, as there are still wild dervishes dancing in the
I
desert.
think that's good. But you see how there he specifically is saying that uh, if it weren't for Christ, we still have these kinds of religious expressions and experiences that continue to exist in the East, but in the West are now marginalized. Whereas we have something entirely different. It's not just a continuation of what was always there in the past. That's the key thing.
And I'd like to add on the bottom of page 233, he says something very interesting that I have witnessed over and over again in my own experiences. And this can only be because Christ has, in fact, been revealed, and Christian Europe, for a time at least, accepted the revelation. And that is this, the last two lines on 233: the modern European seeking his religion in Asia is reading his religion into Asia.
Yeah.
Because I find modern Western peoples of my own acquaintance who take up yoga, not just the stretching, but the actual spirituality that goes with it, or take up Buddhism, or take up any of these things, looking for a form of enlightenment. They bring Christianity with them, whether they realize it or not. Yoga now suddenly becomes a method of getting rid of bad karma, which is just another way of saying of doing penance for your sins. And Buddhism, with its peaceful love of all creatures, like a Saint Francis of Assisi, and so on, is actually a Christian Buddhism, not the Buddhism of Buddha. And so, anyway, I thought that was, and of course, that was going on in his own time, right, Joseph? There was a movement in 19th century England where a lot of, trendy people were chasing after Oriental, Asiatic religions. But in fact, what they were really doing was still some sort of a hybrid of Christianity
Yeah,
and these
and
things.
what you said there, Vivian, is exactly. We've said this before, but just it's worth reiterating what C.S. Lewis says about the fact that the pagans before Christ were the virgin awaiting the coming of the bridegroom, that the neo-pagans after Christ are divorcees or walking away from the marriage. So that's exactly what's happening here. These people can't deny the marriage. They can't deny their experience of the marriage. They're not virgins, they're divorcees. So they take their experience of the marriage and they pose that experience upon things that were virginal, but they can't be the virgin, right? They're bringing their Christian baggage with them, whether they like it or not.
That's right, without even realizing it.
Uh, Page 243, the very bottom, new paragraph. The moral of all this, what he's saying in the chapter, is an old one, that religion is revelation. In other words, it is a vision, and a vision received by faith, but it is a vision of reality. The faith consists in a conviction of its reality. That, for example, is the difference between a vision and a daydream. And then the new paragraph after that. But if it's not a mythology, that is Christianity, neither is a philosophy. It is not a philosophy because being a vision, it is not a pattern but a picture. So it's not that Christianity is unphilosophical or doesn't have a philosophy, but it's more than that. It's not just a pattern. It's not just abstract theses. It's not just dogmatic statements. Uh, it is not one of those simplifications which resolve everything in an abstract explanation, as that everything is recurrent, that's eternal return, where everything is relative, we've seen that, where everything is inevitable, that's fate, destiny, where everything is elusive, that's, again, that's Hinduism or Maya illusion. It is not a process, but a story. It has proportions of the sort seen in a picture or a story. It has the regular repetitions of a pattern or a process, but replaces them by being convincing as a picture or a story is convincing. In other words, exactly as the phrase goes, like life. Uh, so that's another good summary of his saying that Christianity is an escape from mythology, but not by repudiating mythology, but by fulfilling mythology, making it come true. Let's see here.
I have something on 245.
Oh, good. I do too, but you
But
go.
maybe okay. So, earlier in the previous chapter, we talked about Christianity being the only key that actually fits reality and unlocks it for us to now enter and understand and participate fully. And one of the ways Christianity is a key that so many other religious systems, no matter where they come from, isn't, is the problem of evil and how they deal with it or don't deal with it. And this section on page 245, where Chesterton describes the role of evil in reality, or its existence anyway, or non-existence if it's a negation, is to me so amazing. And we see here what C.S. Lewis did in the Chronicles of Narnia. That, remember, Joseph, you've said many times how this was a formative text for C.S. Lewis. And anyway, if you want to read it, you would read it better than I would. This um
Starting where?
These vague but healthy feelings on 245.
Yeah. Do you want me to just read until you stop me?
Yes, well, until it ends with "it is like life," because this is one of those things where the key fits perfectly, even though it fits perfectly in this kind of like story-like sort of way. So if Father's okay with
Okay.
No, I'm fine, but I also want you to read the next paragraph too. So go ahead, Joseph.
that.
Yeah, I was wanting to read the next paragraph too because they go from the problem of evil to the problem of progress. But let's tackle the problem of evil first.
Yes.
These vague but healthy feelings, if he followed them out, would result in the idea that evil is in some way an exception, but an enormous exception. And ultimately, that evil is an invasion, or yet more truly, a rebellion. He does not think that everything is right, or that everything is wrong, or that everything is equally right and wrong. But he does think that right has a right to be right, and therefore a right to be there. And wrong has no right to be wrong, and therefore no right to be there. It is the prince of the world, but it is also a usurper. So he will apprehend vaguely what the vision will give to him vividly, no less than all that strange story of treason in heaven and the great desertion by which evil damaged and tried to destroy a cosmos that it could not create. It is a very strange story, and its proportions and its lines and colours are as arbitrary and absolute as the artistic composition of a picture. It is a vision which we do in fact symbolize in pictures by titanic limbs and passionate tints of plumage. All that abysmal vision of falling stars and the peacock panoplies of the night. But that strange story has one small advantage over the diagrams. It is like life.
So that two things are mentioned there. One, evil, as you mentioned, the problem of evil, and the superiority of Christianity to mere philosophy, that it's like life.
Mhm,
Now now comes this is a really critical theme in our lifetime, and I've had a long one. Progress. We live
mhm,
it because we've had so much technological progress. We
mhm.
think that everything is always getting better and better. That we can expect that next year my iPhone will be a new model and it'll be better, and that may be true, but we can't, just like we can't make everything fit uh, the constraints of scientific knowledge. Likewise, we can't think of everything good as being a result of progress. But so read this next paragraph, Joseph.
Another example might be found not in the problem of evil, but in what is called the problem of progress. One of the ablest agnostics of the age once asked me whether I thought mankind grew better or grew worse or remained the same. He was confident that the alternative covered all possibilities. He did not see that it only covered patterns and not pictures, processes and not stories. I asked him whether he thought that Mr. Smith of Golders Green got better or worse, or remained exactly the same between the age of 30 and 40. It then seemed to dawn on him that it would rather depend on Mr. Smith and how he chose to go on. It had never occurred to him that it might depend on how mankind chose to go on, and that its course was not a straight line or an upward or downward curve, but a track like that of a man across a valley, going where he liked and stopping where he chose, going into a church or falling drunk in a ditch. The life of man is a story, an adventure story, and in our vision, the same is true even of the story of God.
So that's his response to the idea of progress as being kind of, is it a mathematical trend? Well, not for humanity, it's not. We can invent AI and then use it to destroy the world. I mean, it doesn't mean we're getting better.
Yeah, and bad ideas have bad consequences. Good ideas have good consequences. So obviously, if we have bad philosophies, we're going to have bad consequences. We've had Adolf Hitler, we've had Joseph Stalin, we've had Chairman Mao, we have abortion mills, etc. That obviously, if you're going to call that progress, you have a very warped understanding of what progress is.
Joseph, I have kind of a, side note on this. In that wonderful book by C.S. Lewis, The Great Divorce, there's a scene where Lewis, led by MacDonald, sees this carriage coming and trumpets blowing and a big parade and this woman there surrounded by, whatever the valets and everything and with flowers and Lewis says, is it the Virgin Mary? And MacDonald said, no, that's Sally Smith from Golders Green. And I'm just wondering,
Yeah,
he talks here
right.
about who was it here?
Yeah,
It was
Mr. Smith, Mr. Smith of Golders
yeah.
Green.
So is that a trope in English literature of
No,
Golders Green?
I tell you what it is. I think it's a tribute, not a trope. I think it's a tribute by C.S. Lewis, and I hadn't thought about that before, that connection. I think it's Sarah Smith, if I correct rather sadly, but either way, it's certainly Miss Smith or Mrs. Smith
Yeah,
from Golders Green.
yeah.
So that's I think that's C.S. Lewis with an intertextual deferential nod to his mentor, Chesterton. That's what I
Okay.
think.
Wow.
But I hadn't thought about that before. Thank you, Father.
Well, then just below where you stop reading on page 246, that little beginning of the paragraph, this ties this chapter in with the whole first part of the book. The Catholic faith is the reconciliation because it is realization both of mythology and philosophy, because he talked about the two sides of the human brain, one doing calculations and one painting pictures. Uh, it is a story, and in that sense, one of 100 stories. Only is a true story. It is philosophy, and in that sense, one of 100 philosophies. Only is a philosophy that is like life. But above all, it is a reconciliation because it is something that can only be called the philosophy of stories. He sums these things up many times, and each time is different. But each time is insightful and enlightening, I find. Um, uh, let's end this. I want you to read a paragraph, Joseph, and we'll end this chapter on it. Page 248, that new paragraph.
To sum up.
Yeah. Yes.
To sum up, the sanity of the world was restored, and the soul of man offered salvation by something which did indeed satisfy the two warring tendencies of the past, which had never been satisfied in full, and most certainly never satisfied together. It met the mythological search for romance by being a story, and the philosophical search for truth by being a true story. That is why the ideal figure has to be a historical character, as nobody had ever felt Adonis or Pan to be a historical character. But that is also why the historical character had to be the ideal figure, and even fulfill many of the functions given to these other ideal figures. Why he was at once the sacrifice and the feast, why he could be shown under the emblems of the growing vine or the rising sun. The more deeply we think of the matter, the more we shall conclude that, if there be indeed a God, his creation could hardly have reached any other culmination than this granting of a real romance to the world.
Pause for a second. Real romance. So romance mythology, real philosophy, but it's a real romance. Continue.
Otherwise, the two sides of the human mind could never have touched at all, and the brain of man would have remained cloven and double, one lobe of it dreaming impossible dreams, and the other repeating invariable calculations. The picture makers would have remained forever painting the portrait of nobody. The sages would have remained forever adding up numerals that came to nothing. It was that abyss that nothing but an incarnation could cover, a divine embodiment of our dreams. And he stands above that chasm, whose name is more than priest and older even than Christendom, Pontifex Maximus, the mightiest maker of a bridge.
And that is one of the titles of the Pope, Pontifex Maximus. The whole idea of the bridge between mythology and philosophy and the reconciliation of all mankind, under one fullness of faith. It's beautiful. We have a little bit more time. I think we can do chapter 6 more quickly. On page, it's called the 5 Deaths of the Faith, and basically what he's saying here is that the Catholic Church so embedded in itself the culture of its time that when that culture died, people expected the church to die with it, but it didn't. It rose again in the next culture, and he gives the 5 examples here. But he explains what he's going to do on page 250, first paragraph. It is not the purpose of this book to trace the subsequent history of Christianity, especially the later history of Christianity, which involves controversies of which I hope to write more fully elsewhere. It is devoted only to the suggestion that Christianity, appearing amid heathen humanity, had all the character of a unique thing and even a supernatural thing. It was not like any of the other things, and the more we study it, the less it looks like any of them. But there is a certain rather peculiar character which marked it henceforward, even down to the present moment, with a note on which this book may well conclude. And that's 4 lines beyond that. Christianity has died many times and risen again. Read a God who knew the way out of the grave. And so he's going to give the example of the 5 deaths of the faith. And it's actually not entirely easy to find out which 5 he's talking about.
On 255, the paragraph at the bottom, he lists them.
Yeah, but that he lists them there, but he has some different things. Go ahead.
Well, it says at least 5 times, therefore, with the Arian, number 1, the Albigensian, number 2, the humanist skeptic after Voltaire and Darwin, number 3.
And after Darwin.
After Voltaire and humanistic skeptic. How do you read that sentence? So is Voltaire and Darwin 4 and 5?
Yes.
The humanist skeptic, Voltaire, and Darwin. Those are the 5 things. Okay. So.
But the Arian corresponds to the collapse of Roman civilization and the beginning of feudalism. So that the Roman Empire dies.
Right.
And what comes after it?
But you also have to continue the Arian heresy in the eastern half of the empire all the way until the coming of Muhammad. Because one reason why Muhammad was able to make such inroads among Christians was because he basically adopted the Arian understanding that Jesus was not God, but only man.
I was going to say, that those 5 listed. I mean, he talks at length in the chapter here about Islam, but as you say, he's probably incorporating Islam as a ramification of Arianism, which is why he doesn't list Islam separately when he talks about the 5.
It's kind of boring because if you look at Western civilization, which I think is one perspective he takes, you've got the Roman society, which disappears, and you've got the so-called Dark Ages and feudalism.
Right.
So that's the first death is when Rome dies. Then feudalism ends up in nation states in the beginning of the medieval period, with kings, and well, of course, that's feudalism too. There's a second death of that feudalistic thing. Then comes the end of the Middle Ages with the Renaissance, the Renaissance especially. So that's the death of the medieval society. And then after that, you've got the scientific revolution.
Or the revolutionary period that went
Yeah.
with it with Voltaire.
Yeah.
And then Darwin meaning this weird idea of progress
Yeah.
somehow being built into the cake, cooked into the cake.
But
Anyway.
but in each case, they began by saying we've got no room for Christianity, the Enlightenment. We don't need Christianity,
Right.
you know.
And each time they were wrong because Christianity was
Yeah, in the
reborn.
Revolution, we don't need Christianity. We need reason. And then finally, Darwin and science. We don't need Christianity. We've got
Got it.
evolution, you know.
Got
So
it.
those are the
So
five
really,
tests of the faith.
an alternative title to chapter 6, as well as the 5 deaths of the faith, would be the 5 resurrections of the faith. Right, that's the
Right.
whole point. Is that the church has been declared dead on many occasions, and we've even argued about how many amongst ourselves here, even reading this chapter. But however many times the church has been said to have died, it's always risen again from the dead.
And many times, that this line on 255, a society can lose its fundamental religion without abolishing its official religion. We know how men can all become agnostics long before they abolish their bishops. So, this idea that the sickness in the society is also in the church to some degree. And so when the society needs to be purified, the church needs to be purified too. The problem is, or the good news is, the church survives the operation and the previous society does not.
We're really almost at the end of time here, but I would like to conclude by having Joseph read 2 passages
From the conclusion?
from
Oh, you're still in this chapter?
page 258. 2 lines from the bottom to the end of that paragraph. That's the first passage.
Okay. Again and again, before our time, men have grown content with our diluted doctrine. And again, there has followed on that dilution, coming as out of the darkness in a crimson cataract, the strength of the red original wine. And we only say once more today, as has been said many times by our fathers. Long years and centuries ago, our fathers or the founders of our people drank, as they dreamed, of the blood of God. Long years and centuries have passed since the strength of that giant vintage has been anything but a legend of the age of giants. Centuries ago already is the dark time of the second fermentation, when the wine of Catholicism turned into the vinegar of Calvinism. Long since that bitter drink has been itself diluted, rinsed out and washed away by the waters of oblivion and the wave of the world. Never did we think to taste again even that bitter tang of sincerity and the spirit, still less the richer and the sweeter strength of the purple vineyards in our dreams of the age of gold. Day by day and year by year, we have lowered our hopes and lessened our convictions.
So this is all the description of the decline of the church in every culture that's declining. Continue.
We have grown more and more used to seeing those vats and vineyards overwhelmed in the water floods, and the last savour and suggestion of that special element fading like a stain of purple upon a sea of grey. We have grown used to dilution, to dissolution, to a watering down that went on forever. But thou hast kept the good wine until now.
The renewal of the church.
The renewal of the church. And the church is always renewed by saints. In other words, it's saints who come on the scene who are rediscovering for the rest of us the strength of that original vintage and inspire us to want to all taste of it too.
It's
Finally-
beautiful. And again, I help seeing parallels with C.S. Lewis here. The big thing with C.S. Lewis is Christianity and water, right? That modernism is the diluting of the purity of the vintage, with water. So again, he gets so much quite clearly from this book.
Right, but
C.S. Lewis.
it's not just modernism, it's all these other previous ages of the church where the wine got
Yeah,
diluted until some saint, you know, for Hans von Balthasar, that saint was Mother Teresa. She was the one who, in his day, gave him the hope that Christianity was still alive. Here was the real thing in our very midst, right? In this jaded Europe, that it's all just something, you know, whatever from the past, a culture, a this, or that. And here comes a saint living it. And it's like a smelling salt, wakes everybody up.
Yep. Concluding paragraph, Joseph, on page 260, the new paragraph there, this really, again, sums up the idea of the 5 deaths of the faith.
so the one beginning heaven and earth.
Yes.
Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. The civilization of antiquity was the whole world, and men no more dreamed of its ending than of the ending of daylight. They could not imagine another order unless it were in another world. The civilization of the world has passed away, and those words have not passed away. In the long night of the Dark Ages, feudalism was so familiar a thing that no man could imagine himself without a lord. And religion was so woven into that network that no man would have believed they could be torn asunder. Feudalism itself was torn to rags and rotted away in the popular life of the true Middle Ages, and the first and freshest power in that new freedom was the old religion. Feudalism had passed away, and the words did not pass away. The whole medieval order, in many ways so complete and almost cosmic a home for man, wore out gradually in its turn, and here at least it was thought that the words would die. They went forth across the radiant abyss of the Renaissance, and in 50 years were using all its light and learning for new religious foundations, new apologetics, new saints. It was supposed to have been withered up at last in the dry light of the age of reason. It was supposed to have disappeared ultimately in the earthquake of the age of revolution. Science explained it away, and it was still there. History disinterred it in the past, and it appeared suddenly in the future. Today, it stands once more in our path, and even as we watch it, it grows.
Mhm.
Amen, GKC. I'm going to propose that for our next session, we have a conclusion, basically, you know, Chesterton festival by quoting largely from this last conclusion he has, where he sums up the whole book in his own words. So we'll see you then.